And we've got my pleasure now. I'm going to sit down and get the evening started by introducing Alison Macleod, who's joined us. Alison and I have been in correspondence for nearly 2 years since the idea first came up that we should present this wonderful book here, and we finally got you here, which is great. Alison's originally from Canada, but has been living a long time in UK, having gone over originally to study in the University of Lancaster. I knew it was up north somewhere, up north. And during that time, she got very deeply into literature and to writing and fell in love and all sorts of exciting things. And so she wound up staying and is now Professor of Contemporary Literature at the University of Chichester and also an acclaimed published novelist. Her earlier book, Unexploded, was nominated for the Booker Prize, which, as you all know, is a hugely prestigious thing. And this new one, which has been out for about 18 months now, is getting lion-sized acclaim from all and sundry, because I've read it, and it's a really good book. So I'm genuinely, I always say I'm excited and delighted, but tonight I'm genuinely really excited and delighted to be having the opportunity to talk with Alison about her book. In a moment, I'm going to let Alison take over for a bit, but can I just ask how many of you read all of it, some of it, read the jacket?
Oh,
a few, yeah, okay. There's no shame in not having got around to it, but I hope after you'll buy one and Alison will sign them, because I can't recommend it strongly enough if you like great writing. Anyhow, so for those who are not fully familiar with the book, I'll just give a very quick outline of what we're dealing with here. Tenderness is a novel, but it's also a major research project because it looks deeply at what was happening in Lawrence's life when he was simultaneously having a lot of trouble with some of his earlier works, getting into trouble with the critics, beginning to think about the themes of what became Lady Chatterley, was falling in love with the woman who was probably the model for Lady Chatterley, was in and out of Tuscany and West Sussex through this time in between 1915 and 1928. And indeed, at the beginning of the book, was busy dying, having just published the book and knowing that it was going to, in a sense, be a failure because it was going to be rejected by the censors and all the rest of it. So that's why I say it's a research piece. And it also fast forward to the facts of the trial in 1960, the famous trial in London, which is a great watershed in the cultural history, and ushered in the 60s in a sense. But at the same time, it's deeply imagined fiction, and she goes right inside the mind of Lawrence and Frida, his difficult German wife, and all the people they knew, most of whom were historic figures. Yes. But so it has the license of fiction and the accuracy of research. And so it's about the genesis and the fact and the story of Lady Chatterley, but it's also about the themes of Lady Chatterley. And Tenderness was the working title that Lawrence used for what became Lady Chatterley's lover. And so it all weaves together, and it's a wonderful achievement. So that's what we're dealing with. And what I'm going to suggest we do to get started, I'm going to invite Alison to read a section from the book. And then she's going to give us a few slides talking a little bit about the work she did researching the Tuscany part of the story over the last few years. It's a lot of research involved.
About 4 or 5 years.
Yeah. Yes. So, Alison, over to you for that.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you. Is everyone hearing me okay? Brilliant. Thank you so much for having me here in Florence. It's just an absolute delight to be with you this evening. If I could just collect my thoughts and try to pick up from that wonderful introduction, Simon. Thank you so much. It is, as Simon was saying, my novel Tenderness is very much the story of the genesis of D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley, of his novel. So it's a story of a story, in other words. And what intrigued me is not only the creation of everything that sort of went in. I'm a sort of an academic with a literature background, and yet when I began to dig deeply, I was uncovering, for me, revelation after revelation, but what actually went into the making of Lady Chatterley's lover. And I also realized that it had an afterlife that was much stranger than anything than I'd known about, even in my 30 long years as an academic. So things were revealing themselves in archives and in letters and diaries. And it was with that I went forward and wanted to write, I realized, about a novel that, in essence, changed the 20th century. It was that sort of made me want to write. So I'm going to step down and try not to flash leg as I do so. And read you a little bit from the beginnings. As Simon mentioned, Lawrence. I didn't want to do all of Lawrence's life. It would have been an even longer novel. So instead, I begin really, I suppose, where life is most intense, which is as life fades. So he's in this bit, he's actually dying in France, but he's thinking back to Tuscany and to the villa where he wrote Lady Chatterley's Lover. So I'll just read. It's a short passage, about a few minutes long. I'm just going to find the light. Maybe it's just maybe just for the. Oh, actually, I think it's okay, Simon. I think. Oh, brilliant. Okay, is this okay if I? Oh, my Zoom friends. I hope this is okay if we're standing. Okay. All right. So the year is 1928, and as I say, Lawrence is in his final days. And there's a reference, although he's dying in France, he has an English nurse, so she's mentioned. And Frida, if anyone doesn't know the story, Frida is his wife. He surfaced slowly from sleep. Beneath his cheek, his pillow still smelled of wild thyme and pine resin from the wood behind their old Tuscan farm villa, the Miranda. A year ago now, too, it had been square, solid, and imposing, with marble floors. He paid £25 for the year's lease for the entire first floor, the Piano Nobile, and it had been their most serene home ever, on the crest of a steep hill overlooking 400-year-old fields, which fell away in silver, the olive groves, and gold, the wheat, all as beautifully configured as a Renaissance landscape by an old master. At the front of the villa, clusters of green-black cypresses had stood sentry over his solitude. The rows of broom in the fields, covered in yellow petals, gave off a soft, warm, queer perfume. At the back, his wood awaited him from 8 o'clock each day. The wildflowers were plentiful. The surrounding fields were dotted with the matchstick dwellings of the sharecropper contadini. He had people nearby who passed to and fro, but no one was to pester him. No foreigners, very few visitors who would ever make it up their forbidding hill. Most days he'd needed only his novel and its goodwill. There was Frida, too, of course. She'd made an appreciative audience for each new chapter at their midday meal. Then came his paintings each afternoon, also fine company. At times, his stepdaughter, a grown woman now, came to stay. It had been bliss, or at least as much happiness as he'd felt entitled to, until he fell ill, or more ill, and had suddenly hated the Miranda as much as every other residence where illness had got him. In the end, he couldn't leave the place fast enough. In the half sleep under the watch of the English nurse, he could feel his feet slipping again into his old rope-soled sandals. His linen hat had a wide brim and used to shade his eyes as he wrote behind the Miranda. That final autumn in Tuscany, he decamped to the wood each morning, where he sat, pillow beneath his arse, spine supported by an umbrella pine, and hand flying fiercely across the pages as he outran his prognosis. A novel into which one poured life became a life. He felt the force of his story coursing through its lines as blood courses through veins, as milk rises in a breast, as sap surges in wood. Lizards ran across his feet and birds hopped, heedless of him. Only his wrist moved. In the wind, the trunk of the pine flexed at his back, elastic and powerful. Violets spread in a blue shadow. Moss breathed. A spring banked in wild gladioli bubbled up, dedicated to a neglected saint. On an overhanging branch, an enamel mug dangled for pilgrims and hot children. He never saw either, but each morning a priest in his black cassock nodded as he rushed through the wood on his way to celebrate Mass or to bless the sheaves. A dog raced through the underbrush from time to time, cicadas rattled, and in the neighboring fields, girls sang as they cut the corn. Far below, on the Arno's river plain, Florence was a beautiful jigsaw of clay pot roofs, cypresses, and bright campanile, while at the center of the eternal world, the Duomo rose up, benign and reticent. To Stecker, his publisher, what had he written as his novel fattened? It's a bit of a revolution, he said, a bit of a bomb. Okay. Thank you. Now I wonder, should I hit that light again for the slides? I think I can read. I think so. There we go. That's a bit better. Okay, everyone. So it's particularly special, as you can imagine, reading that for the first time in Tuscany, which is really where my research first began. So it's a great pleasure. Okay, so those are simply the two book jackets, one being American. And for anyone who has started to read, I'll simply say that the girl, the young woman on the cover to the right is actually Jacqueline Kennedy, who is a huge fan, great admirer of D.H. Lawrence's novels. And so I won't say too much, but the novel moves over from England, from Tuscany, it crosses the Atlantic, and that's all I'll say now. It begins in Sussex in 1915, for reasons I'll say a little bit about, but that's D.H. Lawrence. He'd been terrifically depressed with the declaration of war. This is January 1915, and he went into really a nervous breakdown at the declaration of war. He seemed to have a kind of prescience about the scale of the horrors that would unfold. He had a strange sort of visionary mind, and he seemed to have a sense of the industrial scale of the killing that was going to unfold much earlier than most people. So he's had a nervous breakdown. He's living in a tiny cottage because he and Frida had just married. They were living in Italy. They returned to London to marry in the summer of 1914. By September, war is declared, and they can't get back. But nor can they afford to live in England. They can't afford the rents. So first friend lends them this dreadful, moldy, water running down the walls cottage. That's where Lawrence goes into his deep depression. He's offered this cottage in Sussex by a fellow novelist friend called Viola Mennell, and it's her cottage on her parents' property. It's a converted cowshed. And then we've got, that's just the interior, which I was very lucky, very privileged to be shown. It still has the book, I think that mic is, oh no, it's still on. It has the bookcase that Lawrence built, still fitted into the wall, for reasons I won't explain, it's actually on the other side, it's up here. For reasons I won't say too much about, again, not to plot spoil, but the family really wanted everything of Lawrence removed after 1915. And the only thing they couldn't remove was the bookcase, because a wall really might well have come down. It's just a quick glimpse of Lawrence around this circa this period. Lawrence obviously here on the right, Frida next to him. Bertie Fargen here on the foreground on the left is a playwright. He becomes acquainted with in the orbit of new friends and acquaintances he's building in Sussex. And the woman under the hat in shadow, a sort of mystery, is a woman called Rosalind Thornycroft Baines. Rosalind Baines is going to become a crucial figure for D.H. Lawrence. D.H. Lawrence becomes rather fixated at this time. This is a little bit earlier. In 1915, she's married, not long married. Her marriage is coming undone, and Lawrence, one day in Sussex, says to Bertie Fargen, "Why don't we co-author a play or a novel about that particular marriage as an allegory of a sort of state of the nation novel about a nation coming undone, breaking apart?" And Bertie Fargen, who is actually Rosalind's brother-in-law, said, you must be out of your mind, something to that effect. She's my sister-in-law. Of course, I'm not writing that story. Lawrence did not forget that story. So in some ways, Lady Chatterley and the story of a marriage coming undone, infidelities, certainly on the husband's side, which and a love story that unfolds for Rosalind later. It's all going to feed into the mix that becomes Lady Chatterley. Okay, this he persuades Rosalind Baines to. Her marriage is breaking up. There are going to be dreadful headlines. Her father was a very well-known sculptor, a royal academician. And because of his status, his daughter's divorce, which she has petitioned for, it's she, above all, who wants the divorce, because her husband is very promiscuous. And she can't abide the loneliness anymore. She wants a divorce. She persuades her husband to have a divorce, partly by having an illegitimate child, partly. And the headlines are about to break. She knows she's got to move. She decides on Italy. Her father has a contact. D.H. Lawrence says, well, you could go to that contact's house, but actually it's a terrible place to go. I've been, don't go there. And he more or less sets her up to move to Florence. She does. She takes all of his advice. She doesn't quite know where to go. She has 3 small children. And she first of all moves this house in San Gervasio. These are not the best pictures, but they're all I could get when I was nosing my way about here with a friend and trying to find the right house. And I did identify it. And it's on, you can see the street there. On the other side is a beautiful courtyard, but it was hidden away by a gate. And if any of you know Lawrence's poetry, Tortoise Shout, so those tortoises lived in that courtyard garden, and Rosalind and Lawrence used to observe them and laugh a lot as they watched them mate. So what happened was Rosalind initially had this house, but there was an explosion, a munitions dump nearby. This is now 1920. Not long after war, munitions blew up somewhere nearby. The windows were all blown out. She couldn't live there with 3 young children. Lawrence knows she's there. He's trying all the time to get there. He's become preoccupied, fixated, whatever we ought to say, with Rosalind Baines. She's beautiful. She's on her own now. He's fascinated by her. His wife said, Lawrence makes of every woman he's interested in a Gothic cathedral. She then becomes a little cottage, something to that effect. She moves up the hill with the children to, you must correct my pronunciation, Fiesole, Fiesole, thank you. And this is her villa, a small villa up the hill. Again, I think that in my acknowledgements, a taxi driver who rang all the other taxi drivers in the area and helped us to identify it. We got it down to his street. I then thought that this house has a blue plaque. It's where Frank Lloyd Wright, the architect, once stayed. And I knew that she stayed in the house where Frank Lloyd Wright once stayed. This is the balcony where an affair, D.H. Lawrence's only extramarital affair, Frida, his wife, it has to be said, had many. She did. It's just, we might as well be just quite clear about that. Frida had many flings and then a long time affair that outlasted D.H. Lawrence's life, and she was subsequently married. The affair, and the dinner, which I describe in tenderness, begins on that balcony. Wrong way. Now, 6 years later, so we were at 1926, he begins to write, so as you just heard, his first draft of Lady Chatterley's Lover. It wasn't easy to see this. I more or less, I'm afraid, got chased off the property, I have to admit. I did knock on the doors. Nobody seemed to be home. My taxi driver kept his foot on the pedal in case. It was a bit, I had a friend with me who spoke Italian, as I'm ashamed to say I don't. Suddenly a head appears at the window and starts shouting, understandably. I just really wanted to see the view at the back, and that's the house, at least one side. Pictures were limited because quite a burly man then appeared, so I carried on. This is I think if addresses have stayed the same, at 6 Lungano Corsini, this is the location of Pino Orioli's print shop. So where the first edition was privately printed, because no D.H. Lawrence's usual publisher will not touch Lady Chatterley's Lover. Lawrence, with the Florentine printer publisher Orioli, they decide to publish it privately. Lawrence has form in 1915, 1011, all copies that existed of the Rainbow had been burnt in London, and Lawrence was almost bankrupted as a result. So he knew what a painful thing it was. It was such a gamble and such a sacrifice in many ways. This is Lawrence's view, which I did before the burning man got too close. I managed to get a picture of. So I think that's what he saw every day as he was in his wood. I'll just quickly, this is 1960, the child, that's the book it eventually became. It was a scandal above all because it was sold for 3 and 6. So it was not sold for 2 guineas, it was sold for the price of 10 cigarettes. And therefore, it wasn't just meant for gentlemen's libraries, it meant that any school child could get their hands on a copy of it, and many, many did, of course, quite famously. Those are the queues outside the Old Bailey, 1960 London. They actually, as the verdict for the book, it was an international, maybe, I don't know, maybe our first international show trial. And as the verdict came closer and closer over 6 days, queues began to form in the middle of the night, around 4 in the morning. This is to get into the public gallery. And I believe, actually, that, and I'll just show you her. If you read the novel, Bernardine Wall is going to be, she comes in the latter part of it, and she takes us back to that Sussex location. I won't explain away quite now, but she is the last witness for the defense. She's the youngest witness. And there's quite a story that I was really actually quite proud to discover, that a connection that had never been made about that final witness and the whole history of Lady Chatterley. So I just wanted to show you her face so you can imagine her if you do read. I shall pop back up here. Shall I do that, Simon, or just leave? Okay, let me pass you that. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to now have a bit of a conversation about the book and about Alison's work as a writer. I think we've spoken quite a lot about the themes of the novel, but it's interesting that some of the characters, many of the characters, are experiencing various forms of love and sexual love, and tenderness recurs in different forms. And so that's one of the reasons why I found it such an enjoyable read, is that simultaneously you're getting the quite exciting story of the genesis and of Lady Chatterley, and then what happened next, and the trial and all the rest of it. But at the same time, in the stories of the characters, the themes of the novel have been explored in their own lives. So I'm very interested in the balance that you struck, and the process again there, between, as it were, the researched narrative of the story of the genesis and publication and trial of Lady Chatterley, and the imagined emotional life of the characters.
Thank you, Simon. Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that, well, researchers, of course, it's important and so on. But for me, it's never fundamentally about the research. As you suggest, it's about making the research human, about grounding the research in lives as they're lived. And for me, that's the sort of the small miracle of the form of the novel, that it can do that. So I suppose my interests might be very much the same and would overlap a great deal with any historians or any biographers, and my territory would often be the same. Sometimes I know when I went into the Lady Chatterley archive, where I spent a very long time, they sort of indicated to me, well, normally someone comes in here, and academics, and they ask for about 6 or 7 boxes. How many of the boxes do you need? Because usually, if you're working academically, you, as many of you I'm sure will know, you have a particular thesis, and that shapes your parameters, and you follow those. I simply said, well, I need it all. And she said, well, no one's ever asked for all 100 boxes. And I said, so that's the difference. You don't know what you'll be looking for. You don't know what will sort of glint with life until you see it. You don't know what there is until you find it. So I just didn't want to leave sort of any stone unturned in that sense. But in terms of making it human, it seemed to me vital that it's a lived experience for the characters, because it's through that the themes of my novel, themes of Lawrence's novel, will connect to the reader. It's through the body. That tenderness for D.H. Lawrence is quite a radical thing. It's not sentimental. It's not only for him about gentleness or kindness. In fact, it might not even for Lawrence be about gentleness. It's about sort of compassionate connection, which probably admits, the darker aspects of human nature, the vulnerabilities, the fallibilities. It's where at least 2 human beings can confront all of that together and have an honest dialogue. So I suppose in each of the love relationships, and there are a few, ultimately, and also not even the love relationships, because for Lawrence it was wider than just unions, than just marital unions and or loving reunions. It was that connection was his vision for the transformation of English society, or really of any society post-war, after the trauma. For Lawrence, Lady Chatterley is really his vision about how to heal a country after the trauma of a war, and particularly the First World War, which, as we know, was he described himself as if living in a waking coma, living in the nightmare of a coma, unable to move. And again, that nervous breakdown was fundamental. He never fully shook that, but as he's dying, at the Miranda, writing Lady Chatterley, he's pouring in to that book called the novel The Bright Book of Life. He's pouring in everything that matters to him. And for him, he's trying to offer almost a myth, a kind of myth of regrowth, a myth of a regenerated landscape. And it begins for him in the honest, tender relationship between any two human beings, and sort of fans outward to society as a whole, shaking off dead institutions, shaking off dead hierarchies, and finding an honest way of living fully. He said to live fully is both painful and it's fulfilling.
Yes, and it's ironic that you need another world war and then a great show trial to finally get to the moment that Lawrence was looking for. Because
Yes.
I mean, I think it's a reasonable, if big statement, to say that the Lady Chatterley's lover trial at the Old Bailey in 1960 was a real watershed moment in British culture and British society. And then afterwards you get the 60s, the swinging 60s comes immediately after that. And is made possible by that trial in some respects.
Absolutely. I mean, I can't, for the Anglo world, really. Italy was always more enlightened, probably, about the human body and about relationships. But for the Anglo world, Lady Chatterley's lover really changed a century in its tracks. And I find that quite incredible. I also find it incredible that it was, well, for Lawrence, the imagination was the great bridge for human empathy, for human tenderness. So for me, therefore, it's in writing, it's not enough. I mean, I get fascinated by my research, don't get me wrong, and I will do whatever it takes to find what I need to find. But ultimately, that's not my end goal. For me, a novel is different from a biography or an historiography in that it can look at both the ephemera of day-to-day life that gets written out of history, but nevertheless has profound consequences, as we all know, in our own private lives. It can it can lift up the ephemera. It can also lift up the mystery and the contradictions and the flux. So I suppose it's the only way I myself want to do history.
And another thing that's going on, which in a sense comes out of that, is it's a novel about the creation of a novel,
yes,
and the prosecution of a novel, and with magnificent panache. It also includes extended sequences of literary criticism and the whole question of what is a novel and what is a novel for. You have the famous American critic Lionel Trilling is there. E.M. Forster is doing imaginary lectures in Cambridge. And so
well, he was actually. He was.
Yeah,
actually,
I know he was,
yes.
but the one that happens. Yeah,
oh yes.
Is actually in my character's imagination.
Yeah. Yes, it is. Yes, she's imagining her dawn. Yes.
Even though Forster is just around the corner.
She's imagining. Yes.
So I think it's a. I mean, in a sense, you are an academic,
yes.
So you're interested in literary criticism by definition, I would have thought. But the novel contains passages where the nature of the novel and the role of the novel is examined through hardcore literary criticism, which I think is really interesting.
Wow, yeah. Let me think about that. It's a really good question, Simon. As you say, the American critic, and I do my best. I spent a long time looking at Lionel Trilling and looking at his physical appearance. And the American critic Lionel Trilling wrote The Liberal Imagination in 1950, and it was a surprising for its day, almost a kind of bestseller of work. It sort of went, cut across all sorts of boundaries where you think literary books don't usually go. He was quite a celebrated figure. Jacqueline Kennedy. She in my novel, there's a conversation between Jacqueline Kennedy, a great admirer of D.H. Lawrence's novels, and Trilling, who was also a great champion of D.H. Lawrence's novels. A conversation between Jacqueline Kennedy and Trilling took place. I've had to compress it because it happened 18 months after the close of my novel. But they once had a close tete-a-tete for upstairs at the White House for 90 minutes when Jacqueline Kennedy apparently ignored all other guests to sit down with Lionel Trilling and just talk D.H. Lawrence. So using that as a basis for a scene, I just moved it a little bit backwards in time, that conversation. And they together are thinking about D.H. Lawrence, about the trial of Lady Chatterley, because I should say the Americans were first off the bat. They were first to try to publish the unexpurgated, in other words, the manuscript in full with no words cut. In 1959, a press called Grove Press in New York tried to publish it. It runs into trouble there. And I maybe briefly say the FBI, this is what really made me think, the FBI were onto that book and were wanting to shut down Lady Chatterley. When I read that, and I'd actually seen the telegrams intended this are, the FBI telegrams are accurate. I thought, my God, what on earth could lead the FBI in the middle of the Cold War to dedicate man time to a novel? That was almost one of the first questions I had when writing this book. But back to literary criticism, why I suppose for me, it's a dialogue about what a novel is and what the imagination is. And for me, I don't know. For me, it's not hardcore literary crit, because Lionel Trilling actually wasn't. He derided and to some extent had a lot of contempt for the Academy, and he was a humanist who believed that both the mind and the imagination and the emotional life, literature and art, all had or should have a huge bearing on politics. And that's where Jacqueline Kennedy's world and D.H. Lawrence's world bisect. So that's, in a sense, for me, that those scenes are a little bit about the humanity of both. Feel my mic. And it's also about politics for me, above all, I suppose. It's, for me, in those moments, I see what he's talking about if we lose sight of our emotions and our inner lives in any political situation, we're vulnerable to political leaders coming in and manipulating those lives we've left vacant internally. And for me, that leads to Hoover. And I was writing this at the time of Trump election. I'll say no more.
And I think that's right. And it makes a very convincing case for the importance of the novel, particularly in back in the 60s, when it was, as you said, the FBI were trying to take it down because they saw it as subversive. And in the sense it was, because it did subvert the old order ushered in what then became the 60s and everything that followed after it.
Yes.
And I just, when I was thinking about that, I thought I was going to ask you a quite provocative question, which is 70 years on.
Yes.
Where does the novel sit, given that more and more audiences are getting their stories from high quality Netflix drama series, Succession,
yes.
Yes,
and even the Lady Chatterley. Did anyone have a chance to see the recent adaptation with Emma Corrin? I was surprised. I really do think it was quite moving. I think it was well done. Some changes, understandably, but I think those changes are within the spirit of the book. I thought it was extremely well done, really. Yes. So where it is, I think they're difficult to, I mean, when you can think of, I suppose it's partly me looking back, probably with some envy to a time when the novel as a form was so important that it could have those sorts of ramifications, and that that it had political weight. Jacqueline Kennedy had read The Liberal Imagination and was hugely interested in novels, in writing. At one time, she'd taken a creative writing course, had wanted to write short stories for the New Yorker at one point. And the Kennedy administration, as I'm sure many of us know, was probably the most literate administration we've ever had in the White House. So books were at the center of culture. In a way, I would say sadly, they're not. They're no longer.
I mean, sitting in this room, you feel that quite
Yeah.
intensely, that this is a beautiful and important library.
Yes,
But
absolutely.
the demand on the books is in freefall.
Right. Yeah.
So we use it as an environment for
It's a very special place.
Yeah. So I just want to talk a little bit more about the book, which also cue up your second reading, which you'll do. Because we've been talking a lot about the themes. I want to talk a little bit about the writing, because the local writing is of very high quality, and Alison is a fine writer, as many of the people in the blurbs on the cover are saying. And the two things that I noticed when thinking about that, one is this very strong sense of place, and in your little presentation, you gave us some of that. So the sequences in Sussex and the Downs, and then the sequences in Tuscany, the sense of place is enormously strong. It's very fine descriptions of the physical environment, but also it goes beyond that into the spirit of the place, what it's about. And I would say particularly strong in the Sussex sections, which is kind of where you live.
It is where I live.
So, you know,
yeah.
Must have been harder to achieve in Tuscany, which you obviously don't know so well.
Yes, yes, exactly.
But no, I pretty well.
I'm glad, thank you.
And so that's going on. The other thing that happened, which I also admired enormously, is when I was talking to Alice about this earlier, I think I might have been in danger of coining a new critical phrase. It's what I call eternal moments. And putting that into normal English is that moments in the story, in the novel, in the local writing, when a particular incident happens, where it goes into incredibly precise detail, and at the same time you can feel that this is a very significant moment, and time stands still. It's almost like a freeze frame, and this moment, this sort of eternal moment, which then resonates through the rest of the book. And there were a couple of those that I picked up, and there's probably a few more as well. Yeah. And I think it's, you know, as a literary device, but also as just writing, it was very well achieved, and one of the real strengths of the book. So I don't know whether you want to comment on that, but I think we're maybe going to read one of those.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, picking up on your initial comment, Simon, about sort of spirit of the place. I suppose I would say that, first of all, I knew that for Lawrence, particularly for Lawrence as an English novelist, that I had to get Sussex right. You know, he was very much, you know, he often wrote outside. He was so connected to the natural world, the landscape. You only have to look at the huge body of his poetry to see that. You know, I think a few things run through my mind, but the great signal for me that was important. So I'm just going to sip water. Was that in Lady Chatterley's Lover, as I was, you know, rereading for probably the fourth or fifth time, I kept noticing this line, and I thought it seemed a bit of an anomaly. The Sussex Downs, that was her England. And no, as we'll all know, I'm sure many of you know, Lady Chatterley is set in the industrial Midlands of England, in Nottinghamshire. It's, you know, he invents the names of the villages, but that is very much its location, which was Lawrence's own boyhood home, of course, as many of you will know. So I'm thinking we've got a couple married in the early 1920s. She's married into, you know, a grand home, Radby Hall, in the Midlands, somewhere in Nottinghamshire. And in that case, this line, the Sussex Downs, that was her. I'm thinking, how odd that pops up. But of course, I noticed it because I've lived in Sussex for over 30 years. But that was one of the first clues that connected me back to Rosalind Baines. Rosalind Baines used to love walking in the Sussex Downs, and Rosalind Baines's biography, so the woman from the balcony, Rosalind Baines's biography is stitched through Lady Chatterley's biography. And even the final letter in Lady Chatterley's Lover, where Oliver Mellors, she and Oliver Mellors, the gamekeeper, and Lady Chatterley have to be parted. It's dated September 29th, which is the date that Lawrence left Rosalind behind in up at the villa in Fiesole, and went on to Venice. It was really the last thing. We don't quite know if they saw each other again, but the relationship ended. And it's this sort of sad time. He writes her a sort of sad postcard, but the very date he's preserved in Lady Chatterley. So for me, therefore, Sussex, and also because he first hears of the story, because that's where he's overcoming that grief of the First World War, it's in Sussex, I knew I had to go deeply into that. And Tuscany, every place, the landscape of it mattered. A friend of his says he goes into, he can slip under the skin of a daisy, any animal, the mysterious moon itself, the crest of a rising wave. He can become other. It was, quite a compliment to pay a writer that he can become almost anything that he actually isn't. It's a huge testament to the power of his imagination. So I'm going to give you just a little scene. We go back to Sussex, 1915. It's January. He's walking one day up the snowy downs, and there has been a heavy snowfall. He's just arrived from that sort of flooded, moldy cottage, and he's immediately goes out for a walk up into the downs, which are you'll probably know low mountains, or what we call them, low mountains. Okay. In this novel, I sometimes refer to him as the exile. It's the only thing you might need to know. And he's got some field glasses with him. He wiped the lenses of the glasses with his muffler. To the south, he could see the heraldic flag of Arundel Castle. Beyond, the sea stretched out like a blade with the sun on it. For once, he didn't let himself brood on the agonies and privations unfolding on the other side of the channel. All around him, the deep drifts made a new page of the world, and in that moment, a flock of crows, as if harbingers of something, dropped from the sky to the ground ahead. He had wiped the glasses of his breath again when another sudden commotion of movement and colour made him turn. And what ho! A party of 5 was coming over the brow of the neighbouring hill, towing 2 Canadian-style toboggans. For several minutes, he spied through the field glasses. Then, quite literally out of the blue, one of the group, a man, raised an arm high and waved at him. He peered again. Surely not. What were the David Garnett? He was certain it was him. He'd last seen David, or Bunny to his friends, in the painter Duncan Grant's London studio a few weeks before. Did Bunny realize now at the distance of 2 downs that it was him here, Lawrence, newly bearded and transplanted without notice to Sussex? Or was Bunny, he thought it was Bunny, merely greeting a fellow explorer on a neighbouring hill? The exile waved an arm in reply. He called out, but snow muffled the world. He could make out a second man, taller than the others and square-shouldered. A third bent over the toboggans, steadying them on the brink of the slope, not Duncan Grant, too broad. There seemed also to be 3 women, although they were impossible to identify under all their wrappings. Then, unexpectedly, one of them stepped away from the group's frolicking for no apparent reason. She wanted to take in the view, he supposed. The wind caught her hair. He watched her reach up to draw the nut-brown tangle back from her face and eyes, and the moment arrested him. His centre of gravity went. He had to plant his boots hard in the snow. She was a woman sweeping her hair from her face. That was all. Yet the view of her, of the downs, of the blade sharp light, and her arm lifting, it cleaved him through. The moment was of no consequence, and it was visionary. It hit him in the middle of his body. He felt a terrible vertigo, dread, elation, churning. She stared out over the hill, her stance steady in the icy drifts and her face quiescent to the day, as if she herself had been raised from the downland, like some Diana of the wilderness. She wore a man's tweed coat with deep patch pockets, a gamekeeper's sort of jacket buttoned up to her neck, and what looked like a man's thick breeches, practical in the weather. In the frame of his field glass's view, she turned as if to study him, the stranger whom her friend, Bunny, had hailed just moments before. Her red-brown head was flame-like in the winter sunshine. She shielded her eyes with both hands against the sun, or he thought she did, until he realized she too was gripping a pair of field glasses, or opera glasses rather. At the top of Downland, the air was crystalline, snow-flecked, a queer looking glass. In stance and gaze, they mirrored each other strangely, until the man beckoned her away. He looked on still, but she returned the glasses to her pocket and pulled a hat with ear flaps over her head, almost covering her eyes. Their moment dissolved. Lawrence felt a squeeze of loneliness to his heart, the cold iron shunt of bereavement. What had happened? There had been something raveled in that moment as they looked, an uncanny density, a charge sparking from hilltop to hilltop. She was about to disappear. Someone waited for her on the first of the two toboggans, anchoring it to the slope. Another woman with arms rigid at each of her sides as she held it against the slip of the snow. The flaming woman was supple in her movements as she lowered herself onto it and drew her legs up and in. Still he watched. She radiated a stillness, a slow grace, which seemed inseparable from the blue-skied peace of the day. The crows lifted off and landed again, this time only yards away from him. They composed themselves into black-winged hieroglyphs, and his mind's eye blinked. The words formed. The Sussex Downs, that was her England. Thank you, thank you.
And that's one of the eternal moments I was referring to, as I call eternal. And no price of guessing who the woman was.
She's up there. And
Yeah.
she was also, I should say, Rosalind, just on a point of interest, she was the daughter of the woman who was the model for Tessa de D'Urbervilles.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, it runs in the family.
It does, that sort of country fresh beauty.
All right, so look, we're getting towards the end of the allotted time, but I really want to give you all an opportunity to make a point or ask a question. If you're on the Zoom, is there a comment? Yes, there's a comment. We can read out the comments on your behalf, but is there anyone in the room who would like to make a contribution? Here you go.
Thanks. I really enjoyed your novel.
Oh, thank you very much.
Very much
Thank
for
you.
being with us. I want to be greedy and just ask two different questions, but I'll try and make
Okay,
them
I'll
very
try to be
brief.
succinct, yes.
Okay. First is about the kind of mechanics.
Yes.
You just mentioned that you often refer to Lawrence as the exile.
Yes.
And I thought this was interesting because I thought you gave us a profound imaginative insight into what he might be thinking and feeling. And yet that's always a problem, isn't it? Because you can't write it as first person. You don't want a formal third person.
No.
Was calling him the exile a solution to that.
It was a very good insight. It really was. I didn't want to be overly familiar in the narration with him, and it
Can't call him David.
Sorry.
Can't call him David.
No, I didn't go. David sat back and put his sandaled feet up, and I didn't want that tone to the novel. I wanted it to have that degree, not quite formality, but a little bit of distance, partly as a mark of respect. Also, he very much became an exile because after Lady Chatterley was privately printed here in Florence, he had warning from his agent that he stood to be arrested if he went back to England. He both hated England and he adored England, and he couldn't return. So he became an exile, but probably all along in spirit, he was an exile. And he once said to Bertrand Russell, you have to, if one is to do so serious work, one has to retire out of the herd, and throw bombs into it.
Which he did.
Which he did.
Okay, very quick second question, quite different. Was Edgar J. Hoover the apotheosis, the epitome of everything that Lawrence abhorred about dishonesty in sex and sexuality?
Exactly. So for me, that the figure who becomes, and again, is very closely researched, but J. Edgar Hoover, he absolutely stands for, without wanting to make him an absolute monster, and I work hard in the novel so that he isn't only villainous, but there's no getting away from what he was. There's no getting away from the history and the records on that of what he did in his time as his long-standing time as director of the FBI. So yes, he's the antithesis of that tenderness of in terms of everything he was doing. Exactly that, above all, primarily, and it's that for that I have a degree of pity, of sympathy, of compassion, and that I hope that's what I drew upon to make him still render J. Edgar Hoover human in the novel. But because one always needs to balance, I'm not content if I just write a villain, so that's too simplistic. Thank you.
There's some on the Zoom, which I'll go to in a moment, but would anyone else in the room like to make an intervention?
Anything simple,
Let me go,
simple or...
Let me go to the Zoom.
Okay.
Okay. In defense of Villa Miranda, Joanne Weekly says, the owner of Villa Miranda is a lovely man. If you search the villa on booking.com, you could go and stay there. He's the great grandson of Frida and DHL's landlady. How about that?
I don't think you could at the time when I was. I don't know if that's all changed. Well, thank you for the tip.
Christine Wildy says in about 2000, I was invited there by the owner and shown around.
Oh, how wonderful.
He told me that during DHL Lawrence's stay, he used to paint as well as write.
Yes.
However, his father, i.e. probably the above-mentioned landlord, had burnt all the paintings as he considered them too disgusting to keep.
Oh, no, they did go to court to trial. They went. There's a July 1929 exhibition in London, and then a lot of them are now in the States. They couldn't be exhibited in England again. But I'm sure there might have been some that were burnt. There might well have been. But how interesting! Thank you for the comment.
Villa Miranda is in Scandici, if you want to know.
It's near Scandici, I think.
Yeah, people really enjoy the book. Looking towards reading, just a comment on the FBI's interest in Lady Chatterley in the Cold War. There was also a cultural Cold War going on in parallel.
Yes.
Also, the Grove Press was an unusually liberal publisher within the context of American publishing.
True.
Generally.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
Yes. What we could now call a sort of diverse, very radical publisher in its day, Barney Rossett, who was absolutely on the, FBI had a great thick file on him. They also had a great thick file on Lionel Trilling, the critic I mentioned. They had files on surveillance of, I think, 400,000 private citizens. They at that time were surveilling American senators and their families. And at this time, Kennedy is, and Jacqueline Kennedy, she's relatively anonymous at this stage. She's the wife of a junior senator.
Right. Now we've got one at the back.
I just want to make two quick comments.
Yeah.
One is that don't forget McCarthyism had
Oh, no.
predated all of that and had set up
Exactly.
a stage for what Ed J. Edgar Hoover is doing.
That's right.
So,
yes.
you know, that's
Yes, it
right.
features in the novel as well. It's
Exactly.
referred to 54. Yeah.
Right. I just wonder if you see any parallels between D.H. Lawrence and his expose and changing the world relative to sexual freedom, whatever, in England, calling a lie, and what Salman Rushdie has done for his world and the retribution that has come from the zealots that feel he has tread too close to the sun.
Yeah. Well, I suppose, I mean, that as authors, you know, that I admire both hugely. The imaginative world sort of pulls apart. But I suppose what your question really points to so brilliantly is just the rise of censorship again. Well, the fear of censorship, but also the rise of the number of books being pulled from libraries. If you can check the figures, particularly for American libraries. I have friends in London whose books are being pulled off school shelves. It's a growing problem, and of course, Lawrence knew it was the thin end of a wedge of our personal freedoms, that to shut down a book was to shut down, it was to censor and to demand conformity of our inner lives, of our private lives, of our most intimate lives, but essentially of who we are. And it begins with a book.
Here in a larger world.
Absolutely. Yeah. Of course. I suppose when I began Tenderness, and I had a huge, it's quite an epic novel, so there's huge amounts of material. And I began with, you as a novelist, you almost need a question to steer you through the research. And the question I asked relates, I think, to what you've just said. It was my question that was my arrow through the material was, when is a book a bomb? When is a book a bomb?
You pick up that idea at the end of the Old Bailey trial in the most wonderful flight of quasi-magical realist fantasy. So that's something to look forward to when you read the book. I'm just going to indulge myself in just one very short anecdote on this very important theme of censorship and cultural wars and all that. Before I moved here nearly 5 years ago, I lived for 3 years and worked in Warsaw in Poland. And I had a conversation with the Minister of Culture in the government, which is still running the country, with the PIS, the Law and Justice, who are ultra-nationalist far-right government. And they are presiding over full-blown cultural war in Poland. So this is what's going on in Poland. And he said, when the question was, why don't you have tax breaks in the film industry in Poland? And he says, well, we fund films through the National Film Commission. And said, well, tax breaks are surely more efficient. Ah, yes, but if you give them tax breaks, how can you control what they make films about? He said that to my face. So believe me, folks, culture wars are as alive and as vicious, probably more so as ever been. So remembering the journey of Lady Chatterley, I think is very relevant. Very
and also, and on a hopeful note, I suppose what I find so moving is that it was the imagination of 12 jurors who set that book free, and a lot else with it. It's the human imagination that is the antidote to that shutdown.
A pretty good note to end on.
I think so.
So thank you very much, Alison, for coming to spend time.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thanks all to the Zoomers for being with us.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you, friends.
What will happen now, as is traditional, is there's books for sale. Yes, special discounted offer for the people who are here. And Alison will sign them if you buy one. We're going to set them up over here to sign. And for the rest of you, it's wine time.
Oh,
Frescobaldi, and I think we're drinking pink wine tonight, which is rather good. Come on through. Thank you.
Should I thank you? Oh, thank you very much. Thank